You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 1st of September 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Europe keeps talking about security guarantees for Ukraine. Is it ever going to do anything more? The increasingly lucrative trade in children's toys for alleged adults, and why French bread makers need the dough. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Alex von Tunzelmann and Theo Usherwood will discuss today's big stories, and we'll ask the former Australian government official Sam Guthrie if his debut thriller about the unmasking of a hideous conspiracy involving China is trying to tell us something. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Alex von Tunzelmann, the historian, author and screenwriter, and Theo Usherwood, the political journalist and broadcaster. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Very good evening.
Alex, first of all, you join us fresh back from holiday. You have been swanning about the Adriatic.
I have indeed.
I put it to you.
I visited for the first time Croatia and Montenegro.
Delightful, both of them.
Very, very beautiful, very lovely. Big contrast now when you cross the border, because Croatia, of course, now is in the EU. Mm-hmm. Montenegro is not. And there is a sort of, quite appreciable chaos increase as you go from Croatia to Montenegro, and then a chaos decrease as you go back.
If only we could think of another country whose recent history illustrates that difference.
If only. I can't think of any.
But yes, you would recommend either or both countries.
They are both absolutely fabulous. You just have to be aware that things work differently. I mean, for instance, in Montenegro, we were going to get a bus back to Croatia because crossing the border in a hire car can be a bit sort of tricky. Now there's lots of Russians there and all of this. The EU isn't terribly keen to let in. So we got the bus.
So don't take your fur hat.
Don't take your fur hat or your sort of hammer and sickle. Anyway, as we the bus managed to run a full 6 hours late from Kotor. Yes, and sort of as it was 2 hours late turning up and sort of lots of rather nervous European tourists milling around, the gentleman who was in charge of the bus station came out with the wonderful phrase, "Look, you came on holiday to the Balkans, this isn't Japan," which I think was pretty much the motto.
That is outstanding. Theo, you have recently, and this is always an interesting thing for a journalist to do, been interviewing somewhat outside your comfort zone.
Yes, I found myself, my holiday is coming next week. I'm going to southwest France for some R&R, but I've been working bits of this summer, and I found myself interviewing the Strictly Come Dancing judge Arlene Phillips. It was actually it wasn't not a hard-hitting interview at all. It was for a promotional excerpt she was doing for another broadcaster for Save the Children, the charity, and she's a ambassador for Save the Children, and it was around her work supporting families in this country, particularly mums in this country who are struggling to get by. And we did an interview which was going to be used to illustrate, the need. And she spoke about her own upbringing and having lost her father when she was in her teens, and her own working class upbringing, and being given the chance to have the career that she went on to have as, one of this country's top choreographers. And she was just a delight. It was one of those interviews where you speak to somebody, and I had a fair idea that, she would be everything that she turned, in that interview would turn out to be. But she was just, it's very rare to sort of, when you interview politicians, they're always trying to, make their case beyond what they are. And it's quite rare to interview somebody who's very humble and is almost trying to go back from their celebrity or their position to what it is to be just an ordinary person, a mother, somebody who's trying to actually disentangle or disassociate themselves from their fame and their everything that they, their identity in the public eye. And it was just, it was an interview I didn't think I'd ever, never thought I'd do. And it was really enjoyable.
It may say something about the kind of people attracted to politics. I've generally found that the actually accomplished people tend to be nicer and therefore, humble and therefore nicer. Yeah. But we will start on a related note with Ukraine and the ongoing conversations around what security guarantees it may be offered if and when some sort of peace descends. Though the holding of one's breath in anticipation of such an eventuality would appear ill-advised, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has claimed that, quote, precise plans are being drawn up for a multinational troop deployment to Ukraine, although possibly significantly the current occupant of one of von der Leyen's previous roles, i.e. German Minister of Defence Boris Pistorius, has said, quote, apart from the fact that the European Union has no jurisdiction or competence whatsoever when it comes to the deployment of troops, regardless of for whom or for what, I would be very cautious about confirming or commenting on such considerations in any way, which translates broadly as, are you huffing paint thinner? Alex, is there actually much point in discussing this at all, really, or is, to put it more charitably, von der Leyen trying to do that thing of turning an idea into conventional wisdom, making it sound inevitable that this is a thing we're going to do?
I mean, yes, which is sort of actually the true meaning of the word performative, now widely misused to mean an empty act, is in fact, in linguistics, an act of speech intended to materially change reality, which is possibly what she is trying to do, is conjure up the support. I mean, we have seen, of course, considerable support for Ukraine because, of course, last month we had this rather extraordinary spectacle of the Vladimir Putin-Donald Trump summit in Alaska, following which actually there was a remarkable demonstration of European unity with all sorts of very senior European leaders and figures rushing over to Washington to try to sort of de-Putin Trump somewhat. And it seemed at that point very, very united. But what we've seen today really is indeed Ursula von der Leyen coming out with this idea, that a quite specific idea about having a European defence force and European troops potentially going to defend Ukraine, all this, at which point straight away you have Boris Pistorius shooting that down, and of course other nations also not being particularly keen to commit. So, there's the talk and there's the action still seem to be a little bit of a way apart.
Theo, every time this prospect has been raised of European troops being sent to Ukraine, presumably after some sort of ceasefire, Europe has done so looking over its shoulder, anxiously seeing if the United States is still behind it. Has Europe got any closer to actually internalising the idea that it cannot rely on that?
So I think what's so frustrating about this story, when I read it and I went through I was sent the link to the DW website and went through obviously the comments by Pistorius, I was just filled with this deep sense of a frustration that you're reading this story, and there are so many problems with this idea of a European defence force coming to the aid of Ukraine, not least, of course, the Germans, the Italians. Meloni said very openly that she doesn't like the idea. Keir Starmer, and I was at the press conferences, the great, fanfares we had at the turn of the year in Lancaster House with Keir Starmer talking about the coalition of the willing and these Zoom calls that ultimately materialised to nothing. I was at the press conference with Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, and it's the operational headquarters of NATO in northwest London, and they said we are ready to go with some sort of with planning, but there's first you mentioned, of course, it relies on America as being the ultimate guarantor. There's a feeling that obviously Trump cannot be trusted in this regard to step in should European troops be attacked on the ground, defending, acting as peacekeepers. Vladimir Putin has said it is a non-starter. Okay, so he got to the negotiating table in Alaska. That's now gone very quiet. He continues to attack, Kyiv and wider Ukraine at will, with some of the most brutal bombardments that we've seen throughout this 3.5-year long war. And so von der Leyen making these comments, you cannot help but wonder that she almost makes the situation worse, because it feeds into this idea that I'm sure Moscow is going to seize upon in any moment, that immediately you get pushback from European nations, in this case the Germans, saying this cannot possibly work. This is not going to be something that we're going to contribute towards. And Europe looks divided. And that's exactly what Putin wants. He wants Europe to be divided. Europe is divided. And I would have thought it would be far better for the EU, indeed other European nations, to work ultimately with America. And that is an incredibly high risk. I accept that. But rather than trying to go it alone and then have the idea or any plans, excuse the pun, shot down, which only feeds this Russian narrative that Europe is weak. It feels like ultimately it feels like a very hopeless situation. But I just can't understand the wisdom of the EU, of von der Leyen coming out with these comments. She must have known the pushback that would come.
Is it just going back to what we were saying, or what you were saying, Alex, about the summit in Alaska, which strangely feels like it happened about 20 years ago, that this is still Europe trying to remind everybody that they're there?
Well, possibly. And I mean, there is a difficult situation, as Theo said, of course, I'm absolutely certain all the European leaders would really much rather have the US on their side and backing them up, no question. But that does seem a highly unreliable prospect at this particular point in history. So what is to be done? Are they going to, to strengthen their own spines and do something? Or are they, and I'm sure they will, whatever they do, keep trying to persuade the US onto side. But I think we can all see that might be quite a difficult task. It's also been quite interesting today to see that Narendra Modi of India has spoken up in China at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, where Putin is, has spoken in favour of ending the war in Ukraine. And India's been kind of neutral on this. They rely very heavily on Russian energy and have not therefore joined sanctions. So it seems slightly unusual for him actually to say that at this particular point, especially, well, he's very annoyed with Donald Trump anyway because of all the tariffs on India. So there's all sorts of complex things going on there. But I think ultimately this is an issue which is probably primarily of concern really to the European nations, because obviously what everyone's very worried about, as well as Ukraine in and of itself, is Putin's aggression spreading to the Baltics, to other parts of Europe and all of this. I mean, which is a really serious danger for Europe in the longer term. And ultimately, can they keep relying on the Americans to come to their rescue, or is there going to have to be a kind of an actual European effort?
Well, moving along somewhat, one does not need to require an especially long memory to be able to recall a time when, if there was one thing of which a European country menaced by Russia could have been certain, it was the support of the United States, especially if a Republican was in charge. Said support would very much have included US-funded media providing actual independent reporting and some counterbalance to the propaganda of Moscow. In this, as in many other respects, not anymore. Around 500 employees of Voice of America are to be fired, further stripping back an outlet that US President Donald Trump appears convinced is riddled with communists, which, to be clear, it isn't. Theo, is there any apparent logic to this other than the Trump administration's quite visceral dislike of being seen to spend any money at all on anything that might benefit foreigners, even if it also benefits the United States?
I think what this is, I would see this through the prism less about the Department of Government Efficiency and cutting government spending, and more to do with the way that Trump has and his administration has tried to reshape by force, effectively, the way the US media operates. And we've seen freelancers, I'm using this word advisedly, brought in to ask questions, but influencers who have huge followings on social media being brought into the White House briefing room because they would think that they would get preferential treatment. And of course, this is a carry on from and that would work reciprocally, right? But this is a carry-on from the Trump campaign that won him the election, where rather than engaging in any meaningful sense with, quote-unquote, the mainstream media, the established media outlets, he went to podcasts like the Sean Ryan podcast, he went to the Joe Rogan podcast in order to get his message out there, apparently at the behest of his son Barron. But what I read up on the Voice of America, and I didn't realise until it was sort of buried in one of the articles I read right down at the bottom, that this was an organisation that was set up in the Second World War to counter Nazi propaganda. And I think it's quite telling now that the Trump administration has decided, this isn't about redundancies. It just wants to gut the organisation. We're talking about 500 employees of a total roster of 600 being losing their jobs. I mean, it's designed to take it apart, right? We shouldn't make any bones about it. And I can't help but feel that something quite tangible is being lost in American democracy as a result.
Is there, and this is a leading question, Alex, opportunities here perhaps for another English-speaking nation which has a broadcasting infrastructure with global reach, i.e. should the Prime Minister of this country stand up and say to the braying naysayers, I am going to double the budget of the World Service from its currently paltry 400 million quid, and do what the Americans won't?
Should. Will he? Probably not.
No.
Not sure there's a huge appetite for that. Although, I think something that's very striking about these things is actually to look at those budgets and the impact. And I mean, the budget of Voice of America is about $250 million a year, about 260 million something.
A rounding error.
Yeah, a rounding error, exactly. It's really very cheap. And for that, it reaches an audience of around 320 million people globally. I mean, that's huge. It's so cheap for what it does. It's extraordinarily good value if you genuinely believe that promoting American interests abroad is part of America, is in America's interests. That is an astonishingly cheap way to do it, quite honestly. I absolutely would say the same about the World Service, which, as you say, in fact, costs more. But does have a kind of a big global reach, and in some places a better reputation. Although VOA has a very good reputation as well. Really, it was designated a foreign agent in Russia in 2017, and
we should put that on posters.
Yes, I know, right? It's pretty much a recruiting strategy, and actually has been blocked in Russia since 2022. And I wonder whether there's certainly going to be the kind of Russia watchers who are worried about Trump's link to Russia are going to be saying, what is really happening here? Whose interests is this in? Doesn't seem to be that of the United States.
Which is a kind of a preemptive answer, Theo, to the question of if the United States withdraws from this space and a country like the United Kingdom doesn't want to spend the money, is there a concern about the countries that will fill that void, i.e. Russia and China?
Yeah, I remember when, I covered Cameron and Osborne's, David Cameron and George Osborne's austerity years at the start of the coalition. And I remember Conservative MPs making the point at the time, because that's when the World Service budget was being slashed, that this argument for soft power, that the BBC's World Service, it furthered our aims around the world.
Absolutely.
In a way that you couldn't necessarily say, well, it won this contract or that contract, or it helped this person or that person, but it helped solidify what it meant to be British in the global order. And yes, you do have to worry about where the void would be filled. But I also think more broadly, going back to my original point, I think there are bigger questions for journalism about what it is to be, what is journalism and why does it matter? And if you look at, if suddenly anybody can be a journalist, and suddenly anybody with affiliations to a particular party or particular ideology can suddenly say, I'm asking a question, I can do a podcast where I'm promoting this, and suddenly find themselves, if they have the clout on the major platforms like YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, they can suddenly find themselves able to command interviews with world leaders that reach millions, if not billions of people, at the expense of people who have gone through the training and have and that all of that is lost. I think that is far more that is far more dangerous, regardless of the ideology. I really worry what's almost happening domestically, what it is to be a journalist and who journalists are being replaced with. And it's giving a huge amount of power, I think, to very few people who don't necessarily have an understanding, or even at worse, there is a malign influence in the way that they wish to use that power, and I think that's more concerning.
Just finally and briefly on this one, Alex, there is, it strikes me, a problem there in that 30 or 40 years ago, your only option for media was, for all its manifold faults, what might be thought of as the mainstream media. It was professional, it was relatively non-partisan, it was mostly non-sensational. What if it turns out that's not really what people want?
Well, I suppose we'll find out. I mean, I think, on the other hand, I think a lot of people do want it, and I also think a lot of people haven't actually readjusted from that mindset. And that's part of the reason. You want a short answer, so let's not get too far into it. But part of the reason people aren't very good at critical thinking and do sometimes believe what they read on Facebook is that they've been able to rely on certain information sources. If you now can't, but people don't understand how to assess that, I think you do have quite a big problem.
Well, moving very far along to what would appear to be a widespread abandonment of the precepts of 1 Corinthians 13:11, i.e. the stuff about when I became a man, I put away childish things. The global market for toys aimed at adults is booming, manifesting recently in the craze for Labubus, Chinese-made small cuddly toys which millions of ostensible grown-ups are hanging from their handbags and rucksacks, and which might not contain surveillance devices implanted by the Ministry of State Security. In a related development, the Tokyo Toy Show, which occurred this week, tilted heavily towards the market known as kidults. Heaven help us. Does anybody here want to admit to owning or having ever owned or contemplated owning a Labubu?
No.
I have not.
What is, let me Google. What is a Labubu?
It's like a sort of
small cuddly toy.
It looks
People
a bit like
attach
an
it
evil
to a handbag.
rabbit. Yeah, it's got quite a nasty expression on its face. It looks quite evil, and I think that's part of the appeal. It's one of those sort of slightly ugly toys intentionally. And it comes in lots of different colours, and you don't know. I know this, I'm afraid, from children of my acquaintance. You have to buy a sealed packet, and you don't know what colour Labubu is going to come out of the packet. So it's a sort of gambling aspect to it, and it means you buy hundreds of them to try and get the really rare ones.
Have you then reconnected, Alex? I will follow that up somewhat aggressively with any totems of your childhood. Have you gone out and recollected things you owned when you were small?
I haven't, although if I did, I think they would be She-Ra Princess of Power figurines, which I'm quite sad I gave away at some point. I think those are pretty iconic. But no, I haven't, and I really think I'd really rather like less plastic tat in my life rather than more.
Theo, what about you? Have you gone out and repurchased any, I don't know, Lego kits or action figures or other things?
No, but I would like. Can I make a serious point on this?
Go on.
I had a colleague a few years ago, well, it's not a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, who was very honest about, we were friends, and they were very honest about they were struggling with their mental health. And they decided to, in order to improve their mental health, that they were going to buy Lego sets, quite complex Lego sets, and they go to work, and they worked alongside me, our former employer, and they would come home, and instead of spending time on their phone, I've known this new phrase, fubbing. Have you heard of fubbing?
I have.
Where you basically ignore your partner because you're on your phone. Instead of fubbing, they would have dinner, and then they would sit down and they would do I think they're particularly into the Technics Lego, and they would do the Lego set. And it brought that mindfulness where you could have conversation, you could engage. It gave that stillness. You weren't relying on a screen. You could forget about everything else. And they could not speak highly enough of doing Lego. I know people use colouring books, and I don't find the collecting thing so interesting, but I do think. I think if we can kind of regress a little bit into doing things that we can enjoy doing, which don't rely on screens, that don't rely on continuous stimulation, I think that's a really good thing.
A very nearly convincing argument, Alex.
Well, I actually am going to have some sympathy for Theo's point in terms of Lego and colouring books and so on, because I think those are, okay, they're kind of guided forms of creativity, much like, say, doing an embroidery kit rather than coming up with your own pattern. But actually, I think lots of people do find those rather relaxing and improving. I feel that that's in a rather separate category from something like a Labubu that you literally just acquire this landfill piece that is going to end up there. Same with Funko Pops. I don't think there's anything I dislike more than a Funko Pop.
I've got an evening of Googling and ChatGPTing Funko Pops.
Is there a very, very simple way you can explain? Sorry, I'm now being bewildered High Court judge. What is a Funko Pop?
It is a figure based on some sort of cultural figure. So it might be a character from, Marvel or Star Wars or something, or it might be based on a person. You can get all sorts of series of them. It's a sort of large-headed cartoon figurine that you buy, and there are people who spend hundreds of pounds on these things and have millions of them in their houses, and they do absolutely nothing apart from sit there, collect dust, and, as I say, one day go to landfill.
At which point I'm going to admit that overlooking the radio desk upstairs, we do have a Jimmy Carter bobblehead.
There you go.
This is because we once, for reasons now surpassing my recollection, interviewed the managing director of the Jimmy Carter Museum. I asked her what was the biggest selling item in the gift shop. She said it's the bobblehead, and then jokingly she said, "I'll send you one." I thought she was kidding. She did. Big hello to all our listeners at the Jimmy Carter Museum Library, I should say. But to France now, where the proprietors of boulangeries now have bigger problems than having their outdoor furniture periodically thrown at the gendarmes by angry mobs protesting minor reforms to the state pension. The German supermarket chains Lidl and Aldi would appear to be tempting a fusillade of paving stones by retailing baguettes for a mere 25 cents a go, roughly a quarter of what one might typically pay for the equivalent from a neighbourhood artisan. A reminder before we plough on that France takes the baguette seriously. Its price was fixed by order of the state as late as 1987, and in 2023 France lobbied successfully to have the baguette included on UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity, which is quite the accolade for a long sandwich. Theo, how up in arms are the artisans entitled to be? Is this not just the free market doing as it will and people can make their choice?
I love a French baguette. I always take great pleasure, and I'm sure I will in a week's time when I go to Ossigor in southwest France, of popping down to buy my baguette at my local boulangerie.
You will not be popping to Lidl or Aldi?
No, I won't. But this is France all over. Every time I come, I'm privileged enough to visit Monocle Radio. I think the last time I was here, I did something about residents in the rather posh 16th suburb of Paris being up in arms because a Carrefour wanted to open up a supermarket.
I recall this. Yes.
Yeah, is that and it is that's the way the French roll, and quite right too. Quite right too.
But is there a universal thing here, Alex, where if you ask people, would you like your local high street to be full of colourful, independent local stores? People always say yes. And then we say, where do you actually shop? And they say the supermarket, obviously.
There is definitely a bit of a contradiction between what people say they want and what they do. Recently, an American fast food chain had put sort of lots of fruit on the menu because everyone said they wanted fruit on the menu. It turned out no one wanted to order the fruit in a fast food chain. So they've taken it off again because everybody just lied about their intentions. Mm-hmm. People have a self-image, but I think France has been more successful than most places in retaining it. If you do go to even sort of small French towns, will still have markets with independent producers selling really rather wonderful produce.
Even in Paris, I'm always astonished and then irritated with London about how many just independent cafes, bars, restaurants manage to function in Paris, and they're all actually most of them are actually really nice, whereas it's very hard to find something similar here.
It's true. So I think possibly if you don't push back at all on things like the Aldi baguette, then you sort of don't end up with those markets. They do actually go. So there's a tension here, and as Theo says, it's the French being very French about the whole business, but perhaps that is what means that they still have nice markets.
But I think there's also in this country, compared to France, we don't really like spending money on food, on nice produce. I mean, I was fortunate enough a few years ago, I lived next door to somebody an elderly couple, and they were very wealthy. They're seriously wealthy. They did very well, sold a business, multimillionaires. And they still went to Asda. We went round and they had
they were multi-millionaires?
They had utterly butterly, and it was just but people don't. My wife was having palpitations as they slop this margarine on the plate, and it's that sort of, you would never get that in France ever. at any point in the sort of in any socioeconomic group, that wouldn't happen.
Just a final question on this one, Alex. Is this the way that President Macron can turn everything around? Should the French state reimpose price controls on the baguette?
Absolutely.
What are you, some sort of communist? Alex von Tonzelman and Theo Usherwood, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, there is a decent-sized tradition of former diplomacy and political insiders turning to fiction set in and around their former professional milieu. The late MI5 director Dame Stella Rimington spent her retirement writing novels. James Bond himself was the creation of Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, a Royal Navy intelligence officer. The latest heir to this lineage is Sam Guthrie, an Australian international relations veteran whose career has included stints as a trade envoy to China, government official and lobbyist. Sam's debut novel, The Peak, is set substantially in Hong Kong and Canberra. It depicts the calamitous unravelling of a senior Australian politician and the still more terrifying truths it reveals. I spoke to Sam earlier and began by asking if the book is his way of claiming that his former occupations really are this level of high-octane excitement.
I think being close to global affairs, big moments in history, the geopolitics, the uncertainty of it all is of course, it's fascinating. But I love that strain of fiction of these matters that comes from Le Carré down, where, yes, you can explore these great the issues of global politics, but you do it through the eyes of characters, and particularly flawed characters who are often bored, characters that are inside the bureaucracy, characters that are having sort of, political knife fights amongst themselves, and to see through their eyes this moment in history, to explain this moment in history through their eyes is what really interested me. So The Peak is an examination of these big themes: the rise of China, its competition with the US, what's going on in the Asia Pacific, and Australia's place between those two enormous poles. So it deals with all of those meaty issues, but at the same time, it's through my eyes as a boring bureaucrat or a boring diplomat having knife fights in the dark.
I do want to come back to those big themes, but on the question of characters, I've always been interested myself in the degrees to which the foibles of individuals can end up shaping history, and that is, I think, definitely a theme of The Peak. Is that something you personally witnessed happen more than once, i.e. because of a particular personal situation that a person had got themselves into, they ended up making decisions which affected many, many, many others?
Yeah, I think anyone who's worked in and around Parliament, has worked in the ministers, has seen the political pressures on ministers, will know that there is a lot of personality involved in these big decisions that turn into policies that could, define the way that states interact. But I think for me, what was more interesting was this idea of the risk of people being compromised. And it's less about spies. It's even less about politicians. It's the normal everyday person who comes into contact in an overseas environment and doesn't realize how vulnerable they can be. Many books in this genre are about car chases and exploding pens. I wanted to say, let's see what happens to people when they are under the pressure of being compromised. And for many, many years, Australians would travel to China, and there were rivers of gold flowing between the two. And, what happens on tour stays on tour. But I've been, working long enough in this sort of area to have experienced everything from the, you get a phone call late at night from one of the delegates in the hotel, and they say, can you come here? And they show you the bathroom mirror where they can see the video camera recording behind the screen. Or you get the call and someone says, look, it's the middle of the night, I know, but I've brought someone home with me and maybe I shouldn't have, and now she won't leave. She's asking for money or she's asking for something else. There's those instances where, there's research agreements and MOUs done, but the researcher who's really excited in Australia doesn't actually know who they've done that agreement with and where their IP is going and whether it's going to be used for dual use activity. There's, the minister in Australia who happens to get some political donations from a aligned property developer, and then lo and behold says something positive about China in the South China Sea. So all of those sort of moments, from the very smallest to the biggest whales to former politicians and prime ministers, watching what happens when they're compromised and maybe singing about that as a cautionary tale was the part that interested me.
Were you concerned at all, though, about the possible impact of unleashing a fictionalised version of events or of reality upon a world in which quite a lot of people have increasing difficulty telling one from the other? That there's, I'm trying to talk about this without spoiling anything, but there is a particularly crucial plot point which you can imagine the determinedly foil-hatted might light upon. Look at the resume of the person who wrote it, i.e. you, and think, aha, they're trying to tell me something.
I hold by my point that this is a work of fiction.
That's what you would say.
Yeah, that's what I would say, and I shall continue to do so. However, as I said, I want to see myself within a writing tradition where those big issues of the moment, those big historical geopolitical issues, are considered through an accessible lens of characters, strong characters, a plot with momentum. It is the thriller. Things happen. It all ultimately happens within the course of 24 hours. So it's a pacey, engaging story, but we're able to deal with those big issues of the day. And what struck me, particularly in this genre, is that there's still an awful lot of thrillers written about the Cold War. There's still a lot of thrillers written based in Europe and or the Middle East. But as far as grappling with these big issues of the rise of China, competition with the US, and what happens and what does that mean for the Asia Pacific, where the major challenge of the 21st century is going to occur, that doesn't get as much airtime, and particularly from the Australian perspective, as this small country stuck between those two poles. So rather than writing, divulging secrets or anything like that, I wanted to create a accessible story that can potentially motivate discussion, because Australians, as well as other people in Western democracies, need to be thinking about these risks, need to be thinking about these issues, be they issues of potential compromise and foreign interference within their democracy, the impact on civil institutions, all the way through to the potentiality for hostilities, and what does that mean for the future of our country. And in Australia, we've just been through an election earlier this year. These sort of matters of foreign affairs were hardly discussed at all during the course of that campaign. And so I think it's in the interest of a democracy to have such issues ventilated, even if they're just as stories. But in the same way that, as our Mike Burgess from ASIO is talking about risks, so too fiction should be addressing these things, which means that it is an accessible topic that people can discuss. And when people are discussing things, they're informed, and that's better for the democracy.
That was Sam Guthrie speaking to me earlier. His novel The Peak is available now and much recommended. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Alex von Tonzelman and Theo Usherwood. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Faith Eden. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.